My name is Natalie Rowan. I'm 29 years old, and I work as a registered nurse in Columbus, Ohio. Let her go. We're not paying for another surgery. That was the first thing my father said about me while I lay unconscious in an intensive care unit. Machines breathing for me, my heart struggling to keep time with a life I couldn't feel slipping away. He didn't whisper it. He didn't hesitate. He said it calmly, like someone canceling a service that had become too expensive to keep. At 11:18 p.m. on a Tuesday night, my father signed a Do Not Resuscitate order. Not because the doctors believed I wouldn't survive, because the billing department told him the cost, and a number was all it took. 3 weeks later, when I finally woke up, bruised, stitched together, barely strong enough to lift my head, I learned the DNR wasn't even the worst thing he had done while I was trapped between life and death. What happened in the 72 hours after I opened my eyes didn't just change my life, it erased his. Because my father forgot one thing about me, something he had underestimated my entire life. I survived. And this time, I wasn't going to disappear quietly. 7 months before the accident, before the ICU lights and machines counting my breaths, my life already carried cracks I refused to see. The day my grandmother died, the sky over Columbus, Ohio hung low and colorless, the kind of winter afternoon that made everything feel unfinished. Snow clung stubbornly to the sidewalks along Maple Ridge Avenue, melting into gray slush as cars passed slowly by. I stood outside her small brick house longer than necessary, staring at the porch swing moving gently in the wind. It creaked the same way it had since I was a child. That sound used to mean safety. To everyone else, Margaret Rowan was simply an elderly widow who baked too many pies and repeated stories people had already heard. To me, she was the only person who had ever looked at me without disappointment hiding behind kindness. She never talked about money when she spoke to me. She never mentioned what I had cost. I was born with a congenital heart defect, a ventricular septal defect. The doctors explained carefully when I was 4. The surgery lasted 11 hours. Recovery took nearly a year. The bill lasted my entire childhood. My father, Daniel Rowan, didn't yell about it. He didn't need to. He repeated numbers calmly, the way someone states facts that shouldn't be argued. $214,000. I heard it so often that it stopped sounding like money and started sounding like identity. When I was 8, I asked for new sneakers because mine leaked every time it rained. He slid a folder of medical statements across the kitchen table and tapped the total. "That's what shoes cost this family," he said. I remember nodding, even though I didn't understand. After that, I stopped asking for things. By 12, I babysat neighbors' kids to buy my own school supplies. By 15, I learned how to smile while my older sister Lauren opened birthday presents I knew my parents would never buy for me. Lauren got a car at 16. I learned bus routes. Lauren's college tuition was fully paid at Ohio State. I signed student loan papers alone, while my father stood behind me explaining to the loan officer how responsibility builds character. And somehow I believed him. Guilt became normal, something I carried quietly, like background noise you stop noticing after years of hearing it. That's why Saturdays with Grandma Margaret mattered so much. After graduating nursing school and starting at Riverside Medical Center, I drove 40 minutes every weekend to her house. I brought groceries, checked her blood pressure, fixed small things she pretended were broken just so I'd stay longer. Mostly, we sat on the porch swing. She asked about my patients, my long shifts, whether I was sleeping enough. Simple questions, dangerously gentle questions. One afternoon near the end, her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea. She studied me longer than usual, her sharp eyes clearer than I'd ever seen them. "I've taken care of something for you, Natalie," she said softly. I laughed. "You don't have to do that." "When the time comes," she continued, ignoring my protest, "a man named Victor Hale will find you." I assumed it was confusion, age, medication. I squeezed her hand and changed the subject. My father hated that I visited her so often. "You're wasting gas," he said once. "She barely remembers who you are." That wasn't true. Grandma remembered everything, especially things my father preferred forgotten. She passed away quietly 3 weeks later. The funeral was small, efficient, carefully managed by my father. He checked his watch often, guiding conversations toward quick endings. "Let's keep this simple," he whispered when I tried to speak longer during the service. So I stood in the back instead, saying goodbye silently. Afterward, the house felt wrong without her. Still, but watchful, as if something unfinished lingered in the walls. I returned to work the next morning, pulling a 12-hour overnight shift in the cardiac unit. Monitors beeped steadily. Patients needed medication. Life continued with predictable rhythm. I remember thinking how safe routine felt. At 4:17 a.m., driving home through light rain, I calculated how much sleep I could get before my next shift. 6 hours if I skipped breakfast. 5 if I showered. I never finished the calculation, because seconds later, headlights ran a red light at the intersection ahead, and the life I had spent years trying to quietly earn shattered before I ever heard the sound of impact. The crash didn't sound the way people imagine. There was no dramatic explosion, no cinematic moment where time slowed down. Just a violent force crushing metal inward and knocking the air out of my lungs so completely that silence followed. Rain tapped against shattered glass. Pain flashed once, sharp and blinding. Then everything disappeared. Later, I learned I remained conscious for less than 2 minutes. Long enough for a paramedic to crawl through twisted metal and ask my name. "Natalie," I apparently whispered. It was the last thing I said before darkness closed over me. At Riverside Medical Center, the hospital where I worked 5 nights a week, the trauma team moved quickly. Familiar voices surrounded me, co-workers who had shared coffee breaks and shift complaints now calling out vitals over alarms. Internal bleeding, multiple rib fractures, severe head trauma. They operated within the hour. The first surgery stabilized me temporarily, but the bleeding wouldn't stop. Pressure built dangerously inside my skull. Doctors determined I needed a second procedure immediately. More complex, more expensive, and far riskier. Someone had to approve it. I wasn't married. I had no children. The emergency contact listed in my employee file was the same name it had been since I turned 18. Daniel Rowan, father. The hospital called him at 10:30 p.m. Security logs later confirmed he arrived at 10:46. He didn't go to the ICU first. He went to billing. That detail came from nurse supervisor Karen Mills, who had worked at Riverside for nearly 30 years. She told me later there was something unsettling about how calm he looked. Not frightened, not desperate, just focused. He asked one question: "How much is this going to cost?" Dr. Alan Pierce, the attending surgeon, explained carefully. The second surgery could cost between $180,000 and $240,000 depending on complications. Insurance would cover part, but there would still be significant out-of-pocket expenses. My father listened quietly. Then he nodded once. "She doesn't have a healthcare proxy," he said. "I'm the decision maker." Technically, it sounded correct. The doctor hesitated. "We strongly recommend proceeding." My father's answer came immediately. "Let her go." Karen told me no one reacted at first. The sentence landed too calmly to register. "We're not paying for another surgery," he added. No anger, no shaking voice. Just arithmetic. At 11:18 p.m., he signed the Do Not Resuscitate order. His handwriting was steady. Afterward, he asked if there was anything else he needed to sign and walked toward the elevators. He never looked through the ICU window. He never said goodbye. Karen stood frozen behind the nurse's station long after he left. She later told me she had seen parents beg doctors to try impossible treatments, people offering to sell homes, empty savings, do anything for one more chance. And then there was my father, a man who chose the cheaper ending. But Karen also knew something he didn't. Every employee at Riverside completed emergency paperwork during onboarding. Most staff rushed through it, but one section asked about healthcare proxy authorization. 3 years earlier, after watching too many patients lose control over their own medical decisions, I had filled it out carefully. I had named Olivia Grant, my best friend from nursing school. Karen opened my employee file. She found the document in less than 2 minutes. At 11:14 p.m., just minutes before the DNR became active, she called Olivia. Olivia answered immediately. Karen explained everything: the accident, the coma, the father who had just chosen to stop treatment. Olivia didn't ask questions. "I'm coming," she said. She drove through heavy rain for nearly 90 minutes, arriving just after midnight, hair soaked, hands shaking but voice steady. She presented identification and a copy of the proxy she had kept all these years, just in case. She revoked the DNR. She authorized surgery. While my father slept at home believing his decision had ended my story, surgeons were already preparing to save me. Sometimes survival depends on skill, sometimes luck, and sometimes it depends on one person refusing to walk away when walking away would have been easier. If you've ever had someone fight for you when you couldn't fight for yourself, you understand how quiet moments like that can change an entire life, even before you wake up to thank them. The second surgery lasted nearly 6 hours. I remember none of it. Not the operating room lights, not the controlled urgency of voices behind surgical masks, not the moment doctors decided whether my body would keep fighting or finally give up. But weeks later, when I read my medical chart, I saw the story written in clinical language that somehow felt painfully personal. Patient unstable, blood pressure dropping, continue intervention. Lines written by people refusing to quit on someone whose own father already had. Dr. Alan Pierce later explained that twice during surgery, my heart rhythm became dangerously irregular. Twice the team worked to stabilize me. Each time, machines and human persistence pulled me back across a line I never knew I had crossed. By sunrise, I was alive. Barely. Connected to monitors that tracked every fragile beat. Olivia sat in the waiting room the entire night. She refused to leave. Nurses brought her coffee she never finished. Shift changes came and went, but she stayed in the same chair, phone clenched in her hands, watching every doctor who walked through the doors. She later told me she kept expecting my father to return, to argue, to demand control again. He never came back. As far as he knew, the hospital would call him with news of my death. Morning arrived without that call, and instead of contacting the hospital himself, instead of checking whether his daughter had survived the night, my father spent Wednesday morning somewhere else entirely, somewhere far more important to him. He went to my grandmother's house. I didn't learn that part until much later, when timelines began aligning in ways that made my stomach turn. While doctors fought to keep me alive, my father was already preparing for a world where I no longer existed. The house on Maple Ridge Avenue had been empty since my grandmother's funeral, modest, quiet, filled with memories no one else valued. To me, it was safety. To him, it was an asset waiting to be claimed. What he didn't know was that Margaret Rowan had already transferred ownership months before her death. Legally, privately, through the attorney she had mentioned on the porch swing, Victor Hale. The deed already bore my name. My father assumed the property would pass through family estate proceedings. He assumed control would naturally fall to him. So he created it. Using old paperwork from medical forms I had signed years earlier, he traced my handwriting onto a power of attorney document. Careful enough to pass casual inspection. Convincing enough for someone who didn't look closely. He brought it to a notary he knew personally, a man willing to stamp without questions. Within 2 days, ownership transferred into his name. By Friday, he secured a mortgage against the property, $280,000. Approved quickly. None of it went toward hospital bills. None of it went toward family expenses. The money disappeared into debts no one in our church or neighborhood knew existed. Gambling losses accumulated quietly over years. While machines breathed for me, my father gambled on the certainty that I would never wake up. Back in the ICU, my body existed somewhere between sleep and awareness. Nurses rotated through shifts, adjusting medications, checking reflexes, speaking softly even though I couldn't respond. Sound reached me before meaning did. Footsteps, distant voices. The steady electronic rhythm of monitors refusing to stop. Sometimes memories drifted through the darkness, sitting at the kitchen table counting coins for lunch money, watching Lauren open gifts while I smiled politely beside her. Sometimes I dreamed of my grandmother's porch swing moving slowly in warm sunlight. And sometimes, without understanding why, I felt an overwhelming sense that someone was waiting for me to come back. Olivia talked to me every evening after her shifts. She told me ordinary things, complaints about cafeteria food, stories about difficult patients, jokes I would have laughed at if I could hear them fully. She filled silence with normal life, anchoring me to a world just beyond reach. "Come on, Nat," she would whisper. "You're stubborn. I know you're still in there." Doctors say hearing is often the last sense to fade. Maybe that's why her voice stayed. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks during which my father told relatives my condition was hopeless. 3 weeks during which paperwork quietly erased my ownership of a house that legally belonged to me. 3 weeks during which everyone believed my story was already ending. Until one Tuesday morning, beneath harsh hospital lights, my fingers moved. A small motion, barely noticeable, but enough to change everything. Because the moment I opened my eyes, the future my father had already built on my death began to collapse. The first thing I noticed when I woke up was the light. Hospital light isn't gentle. It doesn't ease you back into the world. It's sharp and colorless, exposing everything before your mind has time to catch up. It filled my vision as consciousness returned in fragments, sound arriving before memory, pain arriving before understanding, breathing hurt. Every inhale pressed against my ribs like something cracked inside me was reminding me it still existed. My throat burned from the ventilator tube that had been removed hours earlier, and even turning my head felt impossibly heavy. Then I heard the monitors, steady beeping, familiar. I had worked beside that sound for years, only now I was the patient. A chair scraped softly near the window. I turned slowly and saw Karen Mills sitting beside my bed, arms folded as she watched the screen above me. When she noticed my eyes open, she didn't rush forward or panic. She simply exhaled. "Hey there," she said quietly, pulling her chair closer. "Welcome back, Natalie." My voice barely worked. Only air came out at first. She handed me a damp sponge and waited patiently while I tried again. "How long?" "3 weeks," she answered gently. "You gave us a scare." 3 weeks. The number didn't feel real. I blinked slowly, pieces of memory returning. Rain, headlights, impact. Then emptiness. "My dad?" I whispered. Karen hesitated. It was subtle, but years of working in healthcare taught me how to recognize hesitation people try to hide. "He's been informed," she said carefully. "Not he's been here, not he stayed. Just informed." I was too exhausted to question it then. Sleep dragged me under again, pulling me back into darkness filled with half-formed dreams. Throughout the morning, doctors came and went, asking orientation questions. Pain medication softened the edges of reality. Time blurred between brief awakenings and heavy exhaustion. By afternoon, my thoughts felt clearer. At 2:12 p.m., the door opened. My father stepped inside. Daniel Rowan paused just long enough to compose his expression before approaching the bed. I watched him instinctively, not as a daughter, but as a nurse trained to read faces in moments of crisis. There was surprise in his eyes, not relief. The surprise vanished quickly, replaced by practiced emotion. "Natalie," he said, voice breaking perfectly. "Oh, thank God. We were so scared." He took my hand gently, squeezing it with convincing warmth. Tears gathered easily in his eyes, balanced exactly at the point where they looked sincere. Anyone else would have believed him immediately. Part of me wanted to. "How long were you here?" I asked quietly. "Every day," he answered without hesitation. "I never left your side." Karen stood near the doorway, silent. "I noticed that. Small details matter when you work in hospitals." He talked about prayers, about neighbors asking about me, about how close we came to losing each other. His tone carried calm authority, the same voice he used at church gatherings when people listened carefully. For a moment, guilt crept into me for doubting him. Then he added softly, "Don't worry about the medical bills. We'll figure it out as a family." Bills. Even through medication haze, the word felt heavy. He stayed less than half an hour, telling stories that sounded comforting but strangely rehearsed. When he kissed my forehead before leaving, it felt like the closing scene of a performance. The room grew quiet again. Karen waited until his footsteps disappeared down the hallway before closing the door gently. She pulled her chair closer to the bed. This time, there was no hesitation in her posture, only decision. "Natalie," she said softly, "there are some things you need to know. Not all at once, but soon." My chest tightened. "What happened?" I asked. She sat down. "The night of your accident, your father came here," she began carefully. "He spoke to billing before he spoke to your doctors." A cold sensation spread through me. "He told the surgeon you didn't have a healthcare proxy. He said he was the sole decision maker." The monitor beside me began beeping faster. "And then," she continued quietly, holding my gaze, "he signed a Do Not Resuscitate order." The room felt suddenly airless. I stared at her, waiting for explanation, some misunderstanding that would make sense of it. None came. "What did he say?" I whispered. Karen didn't look away. "His exact words were documented," she said. "He said, 'Let her go. We're not paying for another surgery. She's been a financial drain her whole life.'" The sound of the monitor filled the silence. I felt no shock, only recognition, like hearing a truth my heart had always known finally spoken aloud. I swallowed slowly. "Then, why am I alive?" Karen's expression softened. "Because someone else showed up," she said. "Someone who refused to let that be the end of your story." And in that moment, I understood waking up wasn't the hardest part. Learning who almost let me die was. For a long time after Karen finished speaking, I couldn't say anything. The words settled slowly, like dust after something breaks. My father's sentence echoed again and again inside my head. Not louder, just clearer. A financial drain. It should have shocked me. Instead, it felt familiar. Every memory of childhood shifted slightly, aligning into something painfully logical. The careful reminders about sacrifice, the comparisons to Lauren, the way money always appeared in conversations about me. I had spent years believing I owed my family for surviving. Now I understood my father had never stopped keeping score. I swallowed carefully, my throat still raw. "You said someone showed up?" I whispered. Karen nodded. "Yes, your healthcare proxy." The answer came to me before she said the name. "Olivia." Karen smiled gently. "Olivia Grant." Relief and grief hit at the same time. Olivia and I met during our first semester of nursing school. She was fearless in ways I never allowed myself to be. Loud when something was unfair. Stubborn when rules didn't make sense. The kind of person who argued with professors and somehow made them respect her more afterward. We survived exams, double shifts, and years of cheap takeout dinners together. When we filled out emergency paperwork at Riverside, she had laughed when I listed her as my proxy. "You trust me with life or death decisions?" she asked. "I trust you to fight," I told her. Apparently, I had been right. "She drove here in the middle of the night," Karen said. "Didn't hesitate. Revoked the DNR immediately and authorized surgery." I closed my eyes, imagining her walking through hospital doors soaked from rain, refusing delays, demanding action. "My father didn't know?" I asked. Karen shook her head. "He had already gone home." Gone home. The phrase felt unreal, as if deciding whether I lived or died had been another task completed before bedtime. Karen hesitated before continuing. "I filed an incident report," she said. "Everything he said, every timestamp, it's on record." A nurse protecting her patient. I turned my face toward the ceiling lights, breathing carefully through the ache in my ribs. Part of me wanted to cry. Another part felt strangely steady. After Karen left, the room felt too quiet. Machines hummed softly, marking time while my thoughts replayed years of moments differently. I wasn't imagining the distance. I wasn't too sensitive. I had simply learned to survive being unwanted. The door opened again later that afternoon. Olivia stepped inside carrying a coffee cup and her usual oversized tote bag. She froze the moment she saw my eyes open. For a second she didn't move. Then she crossed the room quickly. "You're awake," she said, voice breaking. I managed a weak smile. You look exhausted. She laughed through tears, gripping my hand carefully around the IV lines. You've been unconscious for 3 weeks, she said. I earned being exhausted. Emotion tightened my chest. Thank you, I whispered. Her expression hardened immediately. Don't thank me for doing what anyone should have done. Not everyone had. Silence stretched between us. I know what happened, I said quietly. Her jaw tightened. Anger flashed briefly before she forced herself to breathe. I almost lost it that night, she admitted. If Karen hadn't called me, she stopped, shaking her head. I wasn't going to let them stop trying, she finished. I studied her face, tired, stubborn, fiercely loyal. Family isn't always the people who share your name. Sometimes it's the person who refuses to leave when leaving would be easier. How bad was it? I asked. She hesitated before answering honestly. They weren't sure you'd wake up, she said. But you've always been annoyingly hard to give up on. I laughed weakly, pain pulling at my ribs. For the first time since waking, warmth replaced the cold heaviness inside me. Someone had chosen me. Not out of obligation, not out of guilt, because my life mattered. Olivia squeezed my hand gently. You scared a lot of people, you know? I looked at her. Not the ones who mattered most, I said quietly. She didn't argue. Later that evening, after she left, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. Something inside me had shifted. Not anger, not revenge. Clarity. For years I thought love meant enduring quietly. But surviving changes things. And sometimes, when someone finally fights for you, it teaches you something unexpected. You don't have to keep accepting the version of yourself others decided you were. If you've ever had someone stand beside you when you felt completely alone, you know how invisible moments like that can quietly change the direction of an entire life, long before anyone else realizes it. Recovery moves slowly. Time inside a hospital doesn't pass normally. It stretches between medication schedules and physical therapy sessions, measured more by pain than by hours. Every breath reminded me my ribs were still healing. Every step down the hallway felt like learning how to exist again inside a body that no longer trusted itself. But physical recovery wasn't what kept me awake at night. Thinking was. Once the medication haze faded, questions filled the silence. My father's words replayed endlessly in my mind. I tried, at first, to imagine explanations that made them less cruel. Stress, fear, panic. None of those explanations survived long. Instead, another memory surfaced. My grandmother sitting on the porch swing, her hands wrapped around a teacup. A man named Victor Hale will find you. At the time, I assumed confusion. Now it felt intentional. On the third morning after waking, Karen helped me sit upright long enough to check my phone. Notifications flooded the screen. Missed calls from my father. Messages from Lauren. Church members sending prayers. I ignored them all. My thumb hovered over a different contact. One saved months earlier after I found a business card tucked inside my grandmother's cookbook. Victor Hale. My heart beat faster as I pressed call. The line rang twice. Victor Hale speaking. His voice was calm, professional, steady. The voice of someone accustomed to complicated conversations. Mr. Hale, I said carefully. My name is Natalie Rowan. I believe you knew my grandmother, Margaret Rowan. A brief pause followed. Miss Rowan, he replied gently. I've been attempting to reach you for several months. I blinked in confusion. He explained that 2 years before her death, my grandmother had visited his office privately. She requested a will prepared outside the family attorney network, notarized internally and filed discreetly through probate. The property on Maple Ridge Avenue, he said, was transferred solely into your name. The room felt suddenly smaller. Solely? I whispered. Yes, along with a trust account containing $85,000. No shared ownership. My grip tightened on the phone. I never received anything, I said. Another pause. I sent certified letters, Hale replied. They were returned. My office was informed you had relocated and did not wish further contact. My father. The realization arrived instantly. I've been in a coma, I said quietly. Car accident, 3 weeks. His tone shifted immediately. I'm very sorry to hear that. I hesitated before asking the question forming in my chest. Is the house still in my name? Silence stretched while he checked records. I will need to confirm with the county filings, he said finally. I'll call you back shortly. Waiting felt unbearable. Olivia watched me from across the room. Good news or bad? I don't know yet, I admitted. 50 minutes later, my phone rang again. Hale sounded different this time. Still composed, but sharper. Miss Rowan, the property was transferred out of your name 3 weeks ago. The timing struck like a physical blow. Transferred to whom? Daniel Rowan, your father, using a power of attorney document. My stomach dropped. I never signed a power of attorney. I'm aware, he replied. No such authorization exists through my office. Based on records, the signature appears inconsistent. Forgery. He didn't say the word, but it hung between us. There is additional information, Hale continued. A mortgage was recorded against the property 6 days ago. $280,000. Olivia swore quietly under her breath. While I lay unconscious, my father had taken ownership of my house and borrowed against it. What happens now? I asked. That depends on how you wish to proceed, Hale said. We can challenge the transfer immediately. I stared at my reflection in the dark hospital window, pale, bruised, alive. All my life I avoided confrontation to keep peace. Silence had almost killed me. Start everything, I said quietly. I want it documented. A brief pause. Understood, Hale replied. After the call ended, Olivia studied me carefully. You okay? I nodded slowly. Not okay. Clear. For the first time since waking, I understood something important. Surviving the accident wasn't the end of the story. It was the moment the truth finally started catching up with the lies built around my life. The morning after my call with Victor Hale, I barely slept. Pain woke me every few hours, but it wasn't my ribs that kept me staring at the ceiling. It was the timeline running endlessly through my head. While surgeons fought to keep me alive, my father had transferred my grandmother's house into his name and borrowed against it, as if my future had already been erased. The realization didn't feel explosive. It felt quiet. Final. At 9 o'clock sharp, a gentle knock sounded at my hospital door. Olivia looked up from her chair as a man in a gray suit stepped inside carrying a leather briefcase worn smooth at the edges. He wasn't intimidating. If anything, he looked ordinary. The kind of person you might pass in a hallway without noticing. Natalie Rowan? He asked. I nodded. Victor Hale. He approached slowly and shook my hand carefully, mindful of the IV lines. His movements were calm, practiced, respectful. Your grandmother asked me to deliver something personally, he said. From his briefcase, he removed a sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in handwriting I recognized instantly. Seeing it made my throat tighten. I broke the seal slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded neatly. Her handwriting looked thinner than I remembered, but steady. Natalie, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer there to help you the way I should have sooner. Your father has always feared losing control more than losing people. I stayed silent too long because I believed keeping peace protected the family. It didn't. The house is yours. The savings are yours. Mr. Hale has every document prepared legally. You do not owe anyone your life simply because they remind you what you cost them. Especially not your father. You are stronger than you believe. One day you will need to stand where I could not. I love you, always. Grandma. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I hadn't cried since waking from the coma. Shock had kept everything locked down, but now grief arrived all at once. Grief for losing her, and grief for realizing she had understood my life more clearly than I ever had. She anticipated resistance, Hale said gently, giving me time. Your grandmother was very clear about her concerns. I wiped my face carefully, breathing through the ache in my chest. She knew he would try to take it, I whispered. Hale nodded once. He opened a folder and spread documents across the blanket. The original will, probate confirmation, and the recorded deed transferring ownership to me months before my accident. Proof, solid and undeniable. Then he placed another document beside them. County records showing the transfer into my father's name. The signature looked like mine, but it wasn't. I stared at it for a long time. All those years trying to be grateful, trying to be less of a burden, and still he had prepared for a version of my death that benefited him. What happens next? I asked quietly. We file a motion to void the transfer immediately, Hale explained. Forgery invalidates the deed. The lender must be notified that the title is disputed. Olivia leaned forward. And the mortgage? Frozen once the bank receives notice, Hale replied, which will create significant financial consequences. Consequences. The word felt heavy but distant. I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about truth. Before leaving, Hale paused near the door. Your grandmother said something else during our final meeting, he added. I looked up. She said you spent your life trying to keep peace, he continued, and that one day you would realize peace without honesty is simply silence. After he left, the room felt different. Not lighter, clearer. Olivia watched me quietly. You okay? I folded the letter carefully along its original crease. For the first time, I said slowly, I think I understand what she was trying to protect me from. For years, I believed strength meant endurance, absorbing hurt quietly so others stayed comfortable. Now I understood something else. Strength sometimes meant speaking even when your voice shook. I stared out the hospital window as sunlight spread across the glass. The version of myself who apologized for existing felt farther away than it ever had before. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of who I might become without that weight. 5 days after I woke up, the doctors cleared me for discharge. I wasn't fully healed. My ribs still protested every deep breath, bruises lingered beneath my skin, and exhaustion arrived without warning. But I could walk on my own, hold conversations without drifting, and make decisions again. That was enough. Olivia packed my belongings while I sat carefully on the edge of the hospital bed, pulling on clothes that felt unfamiliar after weeks in a gown. Every movement reminded me how close I had come to never leaving this room at all. At exactly 10 o'clock, my father arrived. Daniel Rowan stepped inside carrying a suitcase I hadn't asked for, smiling with calm confidence. I figured you'd stay with us while you recover, he said, placing the bag beside the chair. It'll be easier. Family should take care of family. He didn't ask. He never had. For years, I would have agreed automatically, grateful for approval I rarely received. This time, I took a slow breath before answering. That's kind, I said evenly. But Olivia's taking me home with her. The change in his expression was small, but unmistakable. A tightening near his mouth, a flicker of calculation behind his eyes. You'd rather stay with a friend than your own father? He asked carefully. She's not just a friend, I replied. She's been my emergency contact for years. Something shifted in his posture. He didn't understand yet, but instinct told him control was slipping. Well, he said after a moment, forcing a smile, if that's what you want. He picked up the suitcase again and walked out without another word. No goodbye, no hug. Just quiet irritation hidden behind politeness. Olivia waited until the elevator doors closed before exhaling loudly. That was uncomfortable. He doesn't know yet, I said. About the house? About any of it. That evening, sitting at Olivia's kitchen table with a heating pad across my ribs, I called Victor Hale again. Papers covered the table, copies of the will, legal filings, and documentation already prepared. The motion to void the transfer will be filed tomorrow morning, Hale confirmed through speakerphone. And the lender? I asked. Notification goes out simultaneously. Once the title dispute is recorded, the mortgage freezes. Olivia leaned against the counter. So he can't use the money? If funds have already been spent, Hale replied carefully, the debt becomes personally his, meaning my father alone would carry it. After the call ended, silence filled the apartment. I stared at my phone until it rang again. Dad, I answered. By the way, he said casually, as if discussing weather, I've been handling your grandmother's estate matters. You don't need to worry about any of that right now. He was testing me, checking whether I knew. Okay, I said calmly. Thanks for taking care of it. A brief pause followed. He expected questions, suspicion, gratitude. Instead, I gave him nothing. We ended the call minutes later. Olivia stared at me. How are you so calm? I thought about it carefully before answering. Because I finally understand him, I said. All my life I believed approval could be earned by asking for less, needing less, being easier to love. Now I saw something different. Control mattered more to him than connection. And control only worked when no one challenged the story. 2 days later, Hale called with confirmation. The court accepted the filing. The bank acknowledged the dispute. Everything was moving forward. That night, I barely slept. Not from fear, but from certainty. There was one final step left. Something I hadn't told anyone yet. I didn't want a private confrontation behind closed doors where truth could be rewritten later. My father's reputation lived in public. For 15 years, he had served as a respected deacon at Grace Covenant Church, standing before people every month speaking about faith, sacrifice, and family. Everyone believed the version of him he showed them. If the lie existed in public, then the truth would have to exist there too. Sunday was only 3 days away, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't preparing to keep peace. I was preparing to be heard. Sunday morning arrived colder than expected. I woke before dawn, staring at the ceiling of Olivia's apartment while pale winter light slowly crept through the blinds. For several minutes I lay still, listening to my breathing, feeling the dull ache in my ribs with every inhale. Pain grounded me. It reminded me this was real. Today wasn't about revenge. I repeated that to myself while getting dressed. Revenge burns fast and disappears. What I wanted was something quieter, something permanent. Truth. I chose simple clothes, a white blouse, black slacks, nothing dramatic. No jewelry except the small silver earrings my grandmother had given me years ago. I didn't want sympathy. I didn't want attention. I wanted clarity. The manila folder waited on the kitchen table. Inside were copies of everything: Margaret Rowan's will, probate confirmation, property records, mortgage filings, and the hospital incident report documenting my father's exact words. Evidence didn't need emotion. It only needed light. Olivia drove us in silence. As we turned onto the tree-lined street leading to Grace Covenant Church, the parking lot was already full. Families walked toward the entrance carrying food trays for the monthly community gathering, laughing and greeting one another. Normal life. Normal trust. Victor Hale stood near the entrance, gray coat buttoned neatly, briefcase in hand. He gave me a small nod when I stepped out of the car. "You ready?" Olivia asked quietly. I nodded. I think I've been ready longer than I realized. Inside, the service had already begun. Hymns echoed through the sanctuary. I slipped into a seat near the back, unnoticed at first. Then my father turned. His face brightened instantly when he saw me. Pride, relief, affection arranged perfectly across his expression. He lifted a hand in greeting, the image of a grateful father welcoming a miracle. I waved back. The service ended at noon and the congregation moved into the fellowship hall. Folding tables filled the room, covered with casseroles and conversation. Children ran between chairs while adults gathered in warm circles. At the front stood my father beside the microphone. He always spoke first. He tapped it lightly, smiling as the room quieted. "As many of you know," he began warmly, "my youngest daughter was in a terrible accident last month." People turned toward me with sympathetic smiles. "She was in a coma for weeks," he continued, voice thick with emotion. "There were moments we thought we might lose her, but God is faithful." Applause followed. I felt the sound pass through me without touching me. "There is nothing more frightening," he said, pausing perfectly, "than almost losing your child. I never left her side. I prayed every night." The lie settled heavily across the room. I stood. My legs trembled slightly as I walked forward, but each step felt steadier than the last. Conversations faded as people noticed movement. My father smiled wider, opening his arm as if expecting an embrace. "Dad," I said gently, "can I say something?" He didn't hesitate. He couldn't. Not in front of everyone who trusted him. "Of course," he said, handing me the microphone. The metal felt warm from his hand. I faced the room, Thank you all for your prayers, I began calmly. I'm grateful to be alive. A few people nodded. But I need to correct something. The atmosphere shifted instantly. My father wasn't at my bedside, I continued. The night of my accident, he went to billing first. My father stepped closer. Natalie, I'm not finished. The room fell silent. He asked how much my surgery would cost, I said. And when he heard the number, he told my doctor, and these are his documented words. Let her go. We're not paying for another surgery. She's been a financial drain her whole life. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone dropped a plate. I'm alive because a nurse found my healthcare proxy and called my friend, I continued. Not because of my father. Daniel's voice tightened. You're confused. The medication. The side door opened. Victor Hale walked calmly to the front, placing his briefcase on a nearby table. My grandmother's attorney, I said. He handled her will. Murmurs spread. My grandmother left her home solely to me, I continued. While I was in a coma, my father forged a power of attorney, transferred the house into his name, and took out a $280,000 mortgage. Shock replaced silence. Hale opened the briefcase and lifted the original will. Notary seal visible. Documentation. Proof. My father looked around the room searching for support. No one moved. I'm not here to humiliate you, I said quietly, turning toward him. I'm here because you tried to let me die, and when that didn't work, you tried to take everything else. For the first time in my life, my father had nothing to say. And in that silence, the story everyone believed began to fall apart. No one spoke for several seconds after I finished. The fellowship hall, usually loud with laughter and conversation, felt suspended in disbelief. 100 people sat perfectly still, watching a version of my father they had never imagined existed. Daniel Rowan looked smaller somehow, not physically, but emotionally, like the certainty that had carried him through years of admiration had suddenly disappeared. His eyes moved from face to face, searching for agreement, sympathy, anything that might restore control. He found none. Pastor Allen stepped forward quietly, hands folded in front of him. Daniel, he said gently, I think it would be best if you stepped outside for now. The words were calm, but final. My father opened his mouth as if to argue, then stopped. For the first time in my life, he looked unsure of what role he was supposed to play. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit. The door closed softly behind him. Only then did sound return. Whispers, chairs shifting, stunned conversations breaking out around the room. A few people approached me carefully, offering brief hugs or quiet squeezes of my hand. No applause, just understanding. Truth rarely arrives loudly. Outside, cold air filled my lungs as I stepped into the parking lot. Olivia waited near the car, watching my face carefully. How do you feel? She asked. I thought about it. Not victorious, not relieved, light. Like I had been holding my breath for 29 years and finally exhaled. Within 24 hours, consequences began moving faster than I expected. The bank froze the mortgage once Victor Hale's filing reached their fraud department. Without clear ownership, the loan became unsecured. The money my father had already spent didn't disappear. It became debt attached solely to him. 2 days later, county investigators contacted Hale requesting documentation. Forgery and mortgage fraud carried real consequences. By Tuesday evening, the church board asked my father to step down as deacon. The decision was unanimous. Word spread quickly through the community. Clients canceled service appointments. Calls stopped coming. Reputation, something built slowly over decades, vanished almost overnight. He called me late that night. I almost didn't answer. You destroyed me, he said when I picked up. His voice sounded hollow, stripped of confidence. I closed my eyes briefly before replying. No, I said quietly. You destroyed yourself. I just stopped protecting the lie. Silence followed. Then the call ended. A week later, another discovery surfaced during the investigation. 3 years earlier, my father had changed the beneficiary on my life insurance policy, forging my signature again, naming himself instead of Olivia. He had prepared for every version of my death. None included saving me. The knowledge hurt, but it didn't break me anymore. Understanding replaced confusion. Lauren called a few days later, crying before she even spoke. She admitted she knew about the DNR decision and said nothing because she was afraid of him, and because he promised financial help if she stayed quiet. "I'm not ready to forgive you," I told her honestly, "but I'm not pretending you don't exist either." Healing, I realized, doesn't always begin with forgiveness. Sometimes it begins with boundaries. 1 month later, the court officially voided the fraudulent deed transfer. The house on Maple Ridge Avenue returned to my name. I drove there alone the first time. The porch swing creaked softly as I unlocked the door. Inside, the faint scent of lavender lingered exactly as my grandmother had left it. I sat in her old chair and allowed silence to settle around me. For the first time, I was in a home that belonged to me, not because I earned approval, not because I sacrificed enough, but because someone loved me enough to make sure I would be safe. I used to believe being a good daughter meant enduring everything quietly. I was wrong. Setting a boundary isn't revenge, it's survival. If this story feels familiar, if you've ever stayed silent just to keep peace, maybe today is the moment you stop standing in the background of your own life. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't fighting louder. It's finally choosing yourself and allowing your life to move forward without apology.